Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who is rapidly becoming a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And, as always, for the second time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So today we are talking about something special, the Talgo train. And there you go. You have an example of Amtrak's Cascades Talgo behind an NPCU, non-powered control unit, former F40 PH. And why are we talking about the Talgo train? Well, because one of our best listeners, James Eisenhart, who's out of Pennsylvania, great rail enthusiast, also worked in the rail industry for quite some time. He commented on one of our earlier episodes about the auto train and said, hey, I want to hear about the Talgo, and I want to emphasize that because if you are a listener and there's a subject that you want to hear about, let me know and we will talk about it. And the reason why railroads, well, number one, let me back up here. Number one, we want to be responsive to our audience. We do this podcast for you. I love to talk about trains, but I want to share it with you, and that's why you're here. Secondly, because it is important to learn about the different facets of railroading. And railroading is so big, so deep, and such an important part of American life that we will have something to talk about for decades and decades to come. I hope to be on the air that long. I hope you're listening that long, and I hope that you will all follow James's example and suggest topics that you would like to see us talk about. Also, I want to highlight this. This is James' picture of a CSX freight train, the end of it, the train's disappearing into the mist. This is in the 2024 North American Railroad Calendar, which we are selling on our Etsy site for only $5. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, Phil, it's February. I already have a calendar. I went and I bought a useless calendar from the Dollar Tree, which, by the way, is a great store, or something like that. And I know, but ours has over 40 images from all across North America. Beautiful trains, some of them submitted by you, some of them taken by me. I think this is great, and you absolutely need it on your wall, either in your house, in your office, and actually, you need it in both. So I hope you go to Etsy right now, well, right after the podcast is over, and buy your calendar today. I'll get it in the mail and get it to you ASAP. So, thank you for doing that. And James, thanks to you for being a great listener, suggesting this topic, and contributing to our calendar for 2024. Now, on to the discussion of the Talgo. The Talgo is very interesting because I'm a free market guy, and if there's anything that I love, it is a great entrepreneurial story. And so Talgo comes to us from Spain. The concept was developed by, and I'm going to apologize right now, I'm going to butcher his name, Alejandro Goicoechea Omar. And basically, he was an engineer on a narrow gauge coal hauling railroad in the Spanish province of León. And we can tell that now, when I say engineer, I do not believe that he was a locomotive engineer. I believe he was a civil engineer with a substantial mechanical background. The history is a little bit light on that, but he is the G in Talgo. And Talgo stands for, again, if you're a Spanish speaker, I apologize for the butchery that's going to happen, but it is Tren Articulado Ligero Goicoechea Oriol. So, light articulated train, Goicoechea Oriol. And so, Goicoechea, the name of the guy who came up with the concept, Oriol, the last name of the man who funded the operation. And during the time that Goicoechea was on the Spanish narrow gauge line in León, he had some early attempts at rolling stock development, including where he put together a welded steel carriage that included elements of suspension, brakes, and traction, and that's copied directly out of the Wikipedia entry on the Talgo. And so what I want to emphasize is it's always interesting just to look at in general some of the early attempts that ultimately form whatever the successful activity is when you're talking about entrepreneurs. So here's somebody who is mechanically inclined. He is certainly interested in this and was looking for ways to improve the movement over this small railroad that apparently still exists, still operates, but may have been standard gauge since then. Now, in 1941, he created the Talgo Zero. And so let me get you, for those of you who are following us on YouTube and Rumble, what the Talgo Zero looks like. Because like many early concepts, there wasn't very much of it, but it does give us an idea of what we're talking about and why. Now, you have to remember that when we're talking about trains and when we're talking about moving them, one of the most difficult things to deal with is weight. And a lot of the reason why we look at weight, and we don't look at it the same way that the folks who fly airplanes do. Weight is an issue for airplanes because obviously if the airplane gets too heavy, it can't take off, or that can change the characteristics of the of the ability of the aircraft to fly. But in the case of trains, it matters because of what we're going to do, the ability to go through curves, number one, and the ability to go over light bridges. So what you see here is a triangular frame, and you have independent wheels. So the Talgo, and this is the same basic design that is being utilized today, the Talgo train does not have full axles the way that we think of an axle on a regular rail car. So on a regular rail car or a locomotive, you have an axle in between, two wheels on the end, and it all rotates at the same time, which means it rotates at the same speed. In the case of the Talgo, on the other hand, the wheels are independent, so they're able to spin at different speeds going through curves. And this means that they're able to take curves at higher speeds. The other thing that a lot of Talgo, not all, but most Talgo trains do have now, is the ability to tilt. And tilting helps to shift that weight as the train is going through a curve, therefore making it possible to go through faster than they otherwise could. But again, those of you on YouTube and Rumble, this is an example of Talgo Zero. The interesting thing about the Talgo Zero, other than just the way the design, the triangular underframe, and the independent wheel sets, and of course, if you're looking at this real closely, you're saying, but wait, there's no passenger car on top of that. You can't carry anybody in it. Right, you couldn't. It was just for demonstration. The other interesting thing about it, though, it was pulled by a steam locomotive. So when you hear, if you ever go to Europe or you go to the Pacific Northwest of the United States, you say, oh man, this is a super technologically advanced train. It is, and the first version of it, like many trains, was in fact pulled by a steam locomotive. Now, after the Talgo Zero design, this led to, of course, Oriol getting involved, and just a little bit of background about him. He was a Spanish politician, and he came from the Spanish nobility on both sides. So both his mother's side and his father's side were in the noble and the upper class. His father served as part of the country's military, and his family was helped fund a utility that eventually became part of Iberdrola, which is a worldwide, utility company that controls a lot of subsidiaries, including here in the United States, NYSEG, New York State Electric and Gas, which for many years did receive coal from Conrail and other railroads. So relating it back, long story short, you have somebody who was willing to put money coming from a family that understood investing in industry. And I think that's something that's so important when it comes to the railroads here in the United States, because one of the difficulties that we have today in time with raising capital and deploying the capital that's necessary, whether we're talking about passenger services or freight services, is that we're in an era now where so few in the investment community understand railroading and are willing to put money into heavy industry overall. That's why we see such a lot of money going into something like tech, which thankfully is enabling us to share the stories of railroading, but it's tougher to get it there. So even though now we're at a time when there is more interest in passenger rail thanks to the government being willing to spend more money on it than it was several decades ago, and that freight rail companies are more profitable. It is still a tough nut to crack for them to raise the capital that they need, and that's something that we'll talk about in a future episode. But I think it's important given the fact that you have an industrial family that, again, funded a new and risky, by the way, industrial venture. Now, risky from the standpoint of, you know what, you put a lot of money in it and it could just turn to scrap metal if there aren't real buyers. But that is what helped Talgo get off the ground and also explains the name of it. Now, as I said, Talgo Zero, just frames, pulled by a steam locomotive. They got it up to a max of 47 miles an hour, which, quite frankly, for something with absolutely no weight on it whatsoever, no car bodies, is pretty doggone good. So they proved the concept, and that led to the Talgo 1. And I also want to show you a little picture of the Talgo 1 because it is, first of all, a very interesting design. Looks a little bit like it's been described as being a shark design. I kind of think it looks just like a, I don't know, fantasy world. Hey, look, this is something that you draw it on your notebook in class when you're not paying attention. That's what it looks like. You're not paying attention to what the teacher's saying because it doesn't have anything to do with trains. But the interesting thing about that is it only had a 200 horsepower engine in its leading compartment. And we're going to call it leading compartment because it really wasn't powered by a locomotive, at least not something that we would think of as a traditional locomotive, but 200 horsepower German designed engine there. The point of the 200 horsepower, though, it shows how much you could do with a very, very light body as opposed to the much heavier cars that we're accustomed to here in North America. Now, the Talgo 1, again, helped to prove the concept. Unfortunately, it caught on fire after being stored. It burned, and there is some suggestion on at least one of the websites that I used to research this that it may have been done by competitors. Now, that would be a terrible thing if that were the case, but it does show you how even into the 1940s that passenger rail development, and that's when this was constructed, passenger rail development was still something that a lot of companies and builders, I should say, and operating companies, whether they were owned by the government or they were private, was something they were willing to invest in. Now, the interesting thing about it is this took place, manufactured in the 1940s. The Talgo was being developed during this time. This was the time, A, of World War II, but B, of railroads to the extent that they were able to during the war in the United States, investing in streamlined passenger equipment. This started in the 1930s. It moved through the 1940s as best they could. It peaked and then collapsed in the 1950s. But we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Now, the Talgo 1 was built in Spain, but they didn't have the ability to really manufacture this on a large scale. So they went over to a company that we know very well, American Car and Foundry. An ACF that was known for building, they built streetcars, they built domes, and of course, I want to make sure, just because it's fun, and I took the picture to show off this is a dome car, Union Pacific's Walter Dean, which was originally a 9000 series dome lounge built for its city trains, city of San Francisco, city of Los Angeles, city of Portland, city of Denver, city of St. Louis, in the 1950s by American Car and Foundry. They also built PCC streetcars, and they continue to exist as a freight car manufacturer today. ACF, at its Wilmington, Delaware plant, built the Talgo 2. So some of the early ones. And so it's very interesting to think about as railroading and passenger rail was peaking in the United States. You saw this level of innovation coming from ACF as being the partner to Talgo in the U.S. And I do remember being young and reading some of the train magazines, and you're seeing these images from, by that point, it would have been 20 years earlier from when the magazine was done. I'm 42 now. It wasn't. I'm not quite that seasoned in years, but the magazines would have been 20 years after. But you were seeing images of them being loaded onto ships from Delaware to be shipped abroad. And so this is something that you really didn't see as much. We're used to seeing trains being built in Europe and Japan and otherwise and being sent here. So that's why even at that time, which would have been the 1990s, I was amazed to be looking at that and say, wow, I can't believe this is something that happened. Now, as we mentioned, in the 1950s, you had passenger rail in decline in the United States. And it's sad to think about because, again, as you look back at this where a lot of design had really peaked, and you had the ability to take so much of the comforts that were developing and growing in the mid-century modern era and put them on wheels and whisk people across the country with diesel locomotives that could go much further than steam locomotives, and the beautiful colors, oh boy, all of this. But to think that it happened at a time where the railroad passenger was just simply saying, no, I'm not going to ride these trains. And the railroad companies were seeing this in the form of massive losses coming up on their balance sheets. So there were several railroads who decided, look, we're not quite going to give up yet. Probably the best was Robert R. Young and the Chesapeake and Ohio. But others, including the New York Central, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Rock Island, and so on, decided to give some of these things, some of these new ideas a shot so that they could say, hey, look, we're going to at least make one last push before we give up. And some of these included Train X on the New York Central, the Keystone on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and I think in part because some of these cars are still around, I'd like to show you what the Keystone looks like because it was so unique. And let me open this up for you here. Again, folks, this is what it takes to do a podcast as we talk and try to get everything out to you with no delay. So that you see on the right of the screen is the Pennsylvania Railroad. That is their Keystone, and that's after, sadly, a car caught on fire. But the thing about the Keystone is it was low slung, which means rather than sitting up quite as high as most passenger cars do, you would come in and go down to sit lower. The goal was to lower the center of gravity. The goal was to make it so that you could take curves faster. And so while you may not be able to do everything that you want to do in terms of speeding up trains so that you could go 100 miles an hour, 125 or 150 miles an hour, whatever the hoped for speeds were, what you could do is reduce a lot of the speed restrictions or the slowing down that you would have to do in the middle of the run. And remember, what we look at in terms of speed for passenger trains is actually average speed. And average speed is always going to be quite a bit lower than this timetable speed allowed on any particular segment of the railroad because average speed is going to include a lot of zeros when you stop the train. And it's also going to include the speed that you have to slow down going through a curve. And in some cases, you may have to slow down going on bridges that have weight restrictions or otherwise, or speed restrictions located on them. So anything that you could do to make it so that you could go faster through a curve would certainly increase average speed. And we can see that today with Acela Express and its tilting, because in places where conventional train sets, which now are ACS 64s built by Siemens and Budd-built Amfleet 1 passenger coaches, in places where they can do 125, Acela Express can do 135. In places where a good example is the S-curves through Elizabeth, New Jersey, where conventional train equipment is limited to a max of 55 miles an hour. Acela Express can do 65 miles an hour. So that 10 miles per hour, thanks to the tilting system and adjusting some of the weight, dynamics of the cars versus just the traditional car that you might otherwise think of, that is what helps to speed up these services, even if you couldn't simply have straight track that goes on forever and that you could do 150 miles per hour over without slowing down. So the Talgo comes to the United States, or the concept is embraced by American railroads at this time during a period of decline. So One example of the Talgo being used in the United States comes to us in New England. And actually, I should say two of them come to us in New England, with Boston and Maine, which they didn't have a name for theirs, but it's mostly been called the Speed Merchant because of the locomotives, which were built by Fairbanks Morse. And you see a picture there of the Speed Merchants. These are P1242 was the designation. And I've got to say, number one, you can see the mid-century modern, every facet of it, from the both design overall, but also the McGinnis style paint scheme. And then on the New Haven, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, which was previously controlled by, run by Patrick McGinnis. And he, of course, would go on to do the same thing up in on the Boston and Maine. They called their train the John Quincy Adams. And you see the John Quincy Adams there. These trains were relatively short. They did not have much success. Again, powered by Fairbanks Morse locomotives, which for all accounts did run fairly well. And the Fairbanks Morse, of course, they're best known for the Trainmaster and also a lot of their switchers and the opposed piston engines, which was and remains, by the way, quite a dramatic change from what you see in an electromotive division locomotive or General Electric with traditional piston engines there. Not only were these trains fairly unsuccessful, they also didn't run very much, even though there was no real problem in terms of the Talgo architecture or with the locomotives. They simply didn't fit in to what either the New Haven or the Boston and Maine needed. Also, there were some concerns about ride quality. I have heard consistently from either those who've ridden them or have been able to get the anecdotes down over the years that the ride quality wasn't great. And that's fair, because by the time these locomotives and train sets were introduced, we were really talking about something that was about 10 to 15 years from its beginning, which, frankly, for a very complicated piece of equipment, is not that, is still fairly early. And you've got to think about what 10 to 15 years after the first airplane or first pressurized airliners were introduced, it took a little while before you got to, for example, something like the 747. Another example of the Talgo being employed in the United States is the jet rocket. And there's a picture of the jet rocket right there, which was on the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific. Now, if you look very closely, or if you don't, I should say, look very closely, you might think that's the Aerotrain. And we're going to devote a whole episode to the Aerotrain because it's one of my favorite failures. In fact, maybe that's what we'll do. We'll call it favorite failures. Things out there that we wish had succeeded that didn't. But the jet rocket was also powered by an LWT-12 locomotive built by Electromotive Division, and the LWT-12 is nothing more than an SW-1200, 1,200 horsepower switcher locomotive that was put in a much more aerodynamic body and designed to look neat, which, as you can see from this photo, it really does, although I personally was never much of a fan of that, of those headlights. Now, the jet rocket, the LWT-12 powered the Aerotrain as well, but the jet rocket here had Talgo cars, and you can see this is an example of the end car of the jet rocket, which looks somewhat like the observation cars that we were used to from the traditional rail car builders of Budd, Pullman, Standard, and of course ACF being involved with the Talgo here. But it's also said to have ridden no better than the Aerotrain, and the Aerotrain's problem was it was expanded bus bodies that were also on these single bogies, or single, I shouldn't say axle, because it had axles, whereas the Talgo did not. Jet rocket didn't either. It didn't ride well, and it also had the added problem, because it was so light, it had a lot of difficulty activating the signals. And so this is something that lighter trains in the United States tend to have trouble with, because our signal systems, whether we're talking about for grade crossing gates or the actual signals to determine what areas the train is allowed to occupy on the track, frequently cannot be activated by this. So there's a lot of work that has to be done to make it so that's possible. Those were some of the drawbacks. So the jet rocket was ultimately not successful, and it was put into commuter service and eventually scrapped. There is at least two LWT-12s that still exist. One is in Green Bay, Wisconsin at the National Railroad Museum, while the other is at the Museum of Transportation in Kirkwood, Missouri. I encourage you to go out and see them. They are very much a sight to behold. And oh, by the way, I want to give you this because I always thought it was fairly interesting. See if you can, it's kind of tough from this picture, but I'll put it back there. They have a FlexiCoil B truck on the lead axle. The lead truck is a FlexiCoil B. So it's also notable to look, something that is not impossible to find, but is quite a bit more rare than a 3-axle FlexiCoil truck. Those are also incorporated into this, and that's just yet another thing that adds to the lore of the Talgo and its time in the United States. Now, after this experimentation, you saw a sea change. So by this point, most railroads in the United States were not willing to invest any more money into passenger rail under any circumstances. Some of the few things that you would see were the Milwaukee Road and the Santa Fe purchasing FP45s because they simply needed new power, but they also wanted something that would be it would be possible to utilize for freight service as well in the event, as of course did happen, that the passenger trains went away, or at least in those cases went out of their operation. Great Northern SDP 45s and SDP 40s was another example of this, and also the SDP 35s by the Atlantic Coastline, the Seaboard, and the Louisville and Nashville. So that was very small investment. The last E-units came out in, I believe it was 1963, and by that point they had been built as trade-ins, which still meant they were new locomotives, but some of the parts from older locomotives, in that case E7s, had been utilized to build those, or at least put into a part supply where they may have been used. And I want to point that out. Just as a small aside, there is always a debate within rail fandom about trade-in locomotives, one locomotive being traded in on another. In practical terms, while there is a trade-in program that a variety of the builders have operated over the years, General Electric had one in the 1970s into the 1980s. Electromotive Division had one for many years, really up until the mid-1980s, that started roughly in the 1950s. Very rare. You almost cannot say that because locomotive number 1, that was a F7, was traded in on locomotive number 5, which is a GP35, that there's very much, if any, of that original locomotive being used in the new one. Occasionally, some parts like trucks or otherwise would be put into a part supply that could have been used, but the likelihood that you would say, oh yeah, you know what, we got this from that trade-in locomotive and you see it on the new one, is virtually impossible. And there even is at least one picture out there of a locomotive that was an old locomotive that was traded in on a new one, and the old and the new are both operating on the railroad, the Boston and Maine, at the same time. So when you see these things in roster notations and so on, don't for a second think that, in this case, the Train of Tomorrow E7, for example, did eventually become a Union Pacific E9. And I'm sorry, it's a little digression, but I think it's important because I know it will be discussed somewhere, somehow, and we should certainly get our 2 cents in. But after you saw a lot of the declines of the passenger trains, and the railroads were not investing in operation of the passenger services whatsoever. In fact, they were spending a lot of their time before the Interstate Commerce Commission and Public Utilities Commissions to get rid of their passenger trains and hope that they go away and stay away for a long time. You saw the Talgo take off in Europe. It became a very popular form of passenger equipment there, and the Talgo company, which had been incorporated years ago, continued to grow and thrive. It went one direction while our passenger trains went the other. And we all know what happened after that. You had the turbo train, which was a latter-day effort by United Aircraft to try to stem the decline of passenger rail and, of course, sell something to what by that point had become government agencies. You saw the turbo liners being imported from France by Rohr. So it was built by Yeah, Roar turboliners being built. First they came, and then we had an American version that was built here that looked the RTL that looked a little bit different, but was basically the same architecture. You, of course, had the introduction of Amfleet cars, Amfleet 1 and 2 by Amtrak, and then Superliner, and later on the Horizon fleet, all of which continue to serve as the backbone of Amtrak's equipment. Now, this went on until the 1990s. And then in the 1990s, after rail had experienced the renaissance of the 1980s, where freight rail started to grow and thrive once again, and then passenger rail had slowly come out of its doldrums. Graham Claytor provided able leadership for Amtrak during the 1980s, got it in good shape. You got to the 1990s, and of course you heard about trains such as the X2000 and the ICE train, both of which came here for demonstration. And then in 1994, we had a Talgo reappear. And these Talgos came back in the form of the state of Washington and the state of Oregon worked with Amtrak to bring the Talgo back to America. In 1994, we had a demonstration take place. And then the result of that demonstration is what you see here, which are Amtrak's Cascades. Those are artist renderings of the Talgo 6 equipment that was used with F-59 PHIs to pull the trains, and all in a push-pull format, F-59 PHIs to pull them on one way, and non-powered control units, which were built out of F-40 PHs, which Amtrak owned, to serve as cab cars on the other end. So 1996, the agreement came to purchase these Talgos. They were to be built in Seattle, and the original agreement was 4 trains. So Amtrak owned one and leased one from Talgo itself, while Washington State DOT purchased 2. And they operated between Vancouver, British Columbia, not Vancouver, Washington. Vancouver, British Columbia to Eugene, Oregon via Seattle. And so this is the former Great Northern, roughly the former Great Northern International Service that connected the Pacific Northwest of the United States with Vancouver, British Columbia, under Amtrak that had taken a variety of forms, including a train named the Mount Rainier, which for a while did operate with domes. But this was part of an effort to really stimulate interest and use there. And so in 1998, these trains began operating. They were 12 cars long, and they were capable of carrying 304 passengers apiece. And what is unique about them is they have a tail fairing that is visible. Let's get you a photo here. That is visible as, oh boy, and it looks like we are experiencing a little bit of technical difficulty again. Tail fairing that allows you to overlook the distance between the locomotive and the cars. Because remember, Talgos are very low profile equipment, and the locomotives being used to pull them, which are F-59 PHs, are high profile. So you have a big distance between the Talgo locomotive and the top of the Talgo car, and then the Talgo locomotive itself. So doing this, providing that fairing, and actually you can see it behind me on the monitor a little bit. It helps smooth it out, make the design look a little bit more, coherent. And it seems like, yes, this is what we intended, even though the reality is just it's different equipment from different manufacturers, and it certainly doesn't look like it works well together, although it has for very many years. Now, the Talgo 6s operated quite reliably for quite some time between 1998 and 2019, when the Port Defiance wreck happened. And the Port Defiance wreck took place, and I can't remember the exact date, but the engineer was operating for the first time on the Port Defiance cutoff, which was reducing the travel time by utilizing a former, I believe, Northern Pacific branch line that was rebuilt to high-speed standards. There was a curve on the line that was about 30 miles an hour, but the train took it at about 78, and sadly, it flew off the track and crashed into a bridge above a highway. And the Talgo set that was part of that was destroyed, along with, of course, sadly, some of the crew members and passengers having been injured and killed. That accident led the FRA to take another look at the Talgo equipment, and they said, listen, this really because of the fact it doesn't meet our crashworthiness standards, which are highest in the United States than anywhere else in the world. And no, that's not a good thing for a variety of reasons. But I'll tell you why in a second. They recommended that the Talgo 6 sets be taken out of service permanently, and during the COVID pandemic, they were quickly taken out of service because the service reductions did not require their use. They have been replaced with Horizon fleet cars that are operating with some of the now Siemens Charger locomotives that have been purchased to lead the Talgo train, to be used in the Cascade service. The Talgo 6s were all scrapped with the exception of one small car, which was a bistro car that was donated to a rail museum, and eventually that will be available for people to go through and see it. There are, however, 2 Talgo 8 train sets that have different crashworthiness standards, and they continue to operate in the service, Amtrak's Cascades, along with the Horizon fleet cars and Siemens Charger locomotives. Talgo, for itself, not only are they building plenty of trains all across Europe and also into the Middle East, but they also provided a couple of sets that were to be used on the Hiawatha in Wisconsin. And Talgo has an American subsidiary, Talgo America, which is based in Milwaukee. And I remember seeing one of those Talgo sets, which after Governor Scott Walker took over, they decided, no, we're not going to use these. And Amtrak held on to them at Beech Grove for many years. I saw one of them and could not get a photo because the one place I couldn't stop or pull over and get a good picture outside of the Beech Grove shops, of course, is where they had the Talgo train sitting. And it looks... I'm going to be honest with you. The train itself looks great, but the cab car looks like a duck. And the duck design is something that Talgo really enjoys because regardless of how it looks, it's very good from an aerodynamic standpoint and works quite well with the low-slung articulated cars. So that's why it's there, and you can see a little bit of the duck face that they have on the 2 Washington State DOT sets that are in operation on the Cascades today. So what will the future hold? As always, we don't know. But we do know that Talgo remains a thriving business, and its equipment, going back all the way to the original, the triangular underframe and single independent wheels on an articulated train set, is continuing to serve millions of passengers every year, and it has proven itself to be a strong concept in passenger rail, which is just as legitimate and just as effective as what we have, our superliners, our AM fleet, or otherwise. So I hope you will have an opportunity to go out to the West Coast if you're in the United States and ride the Talgo trains there. It's certainly something I would like to do, and when I do, we will definitely have video here on that for the All Aboard podcast. So we will be back next Monday to talk about our next subject, which is going to be regional railroads and the attempts at Class 1 railroads to get involved in the regional game, which happened in the 1980s and the 1990s. I want to thank you for being with us. Go on over to Etsy.com right now, a link in the description, so you can get your $5 North American Railroad calendar. We will see you down the main line, and I hope you have a great day.